Picture the desert at night, where silence itself seems to breathe. The moon rises over what was once Mesopotamia, casting silver across ruins that have stood sentinel for millennia. Palm fronds whisper in a breeze that carries the scent of dust and time, their shadows dancing across broken walls that once touched the heavens. In this place where empires rose and fell like tides, where the very concept of civilization first took root in human consciousness, there exists a peculiar mystery, a memory of water where there should be none, a ghost of greenery in a landscape of sand. The ruins speak in the language of erosion and absence. Crumbled brick and weathered stone tell stories that archaeologists strain to hear, their excavations revealing fragments of a grandeur almost too magnificent to believe. Yet among all the wonders that Babylon claimed its towering walls, its processional ways lined with glazed lions, its ziggurat reaching toward the stars-one legend stands apart, shimmering like a mirage on the edge of historical record. They called them the Hanging Gardens, a phrase that conjures impossible images. Gardens that hung, suspended somehow between earth and sky, defying the natural order with their very existence. The ancient writers spoke of them with wonder, bordering on disbelief, describing terraces that climbed upward, like a mountain made of living green, where trees cast shade over stone and water flowed upward against its nature. But here, in this moonlit moment, as the Euphrates River winds its ancient path through the desert, the question emerges like a whisper. Did they ever exist at all? Or are they something more enduring than stone a dream that humanity has refused to let die? A vision of paradise that persists precisely because it cannot be proven, cannot be touched, cannot be diminished by the harsh light of archaeological certainty? The night offers no answers, only the eternal presence of the moon, the patient stars, and the sand that both preserves and erases. Somewhere in the space between what was and what might have been, the Hanging Gardens wait, as they have always waited, for those willing to drift through time to find them. Babylon, even the name carries weight, resonating through millennia with associations of excess, wisdom, corruption, and transcendence. This was the city between two rivers, cradled by the Tigris and Euphrates, those twin arteries that brought life to a land where rain was a rare blessing and the sun ruled with merciless authority. Here, in this ribbon of fertility cutting through endless desert, the Babylonians built something extraordinary, not just a city, but a statement of human ambition, a declaration that civilization could flourish even in the most challenging of environments. The rivers were both gift and curse, predictable in their seasons, yet capricious in their moods. Each spring, snowmelt from distant mountains would send floods rushing down through the alluvial plains, depositing rich silt that made the soil incredibly fertile, but also destroying whatever stood in the path of the deluge. The Babylonians learned to dance with this rhythm, building elaborate irrigation systems, constructing levees and canals, transforming chaos into order through ingenuity and relentless effort. The city itself was a marvel of planning and engineering. Herodotus, the Greek historian who traveled through the region in the 5th century before the Common Era, described walls so wide that chariots could race 4 abreast along their tops. He spoke of the city's defensive moat, of gates made of bronze that gleamed in the sun, of streets laid out in a grid that demonstrated a sophistication of urban planning that would not be matched in Europe for another millennium. Within these walls, Babylon thrived as a center of commerce and learning. Merchants from distant lands brought spices, precious metals, and exotic goods to its markets. Scholars studied the movements of celestial bodies with a precision that allowed them to predict eclipses and track the wandering planets. Priests maintained temples that served as banks, schools, and administrative centers. This was a place where mathematics and astronomy flourished, where legal codes were inscribed in stone, where literature was born in the form of epic poems pressed into clay tablets. Yet for all its order and brilliance, Babylon existed in constant tension with the forces that surrounded it. The desert pressed against its walls like a living thing, ready to reclaim every inch of cultivated ground should human vigilance falter even for a moment. The rivers that gave life could just as easily take it away, their floods unpredictable despite centuries of observation. And beyond the immediate physical challenges lay the political turbulence of the ancient Near East rival kingdoms. Ambitious generals, the constant threat of conquest and subjugation. Perhaps it was this very precariousness that made the Babylonians reach so high, build so grandly, dream so ambitiously. When existence itself is uncertain, when the desert and the flood could erase everything in a season, what remains but to create wonders that might outlast the fragile moment? The Hanging Gardens, if they existed, would have been the ultimate expression of this impulse, not merely to survive in a harsh environment, but to transform it entirely, to make the desert bloom not just at ground level, but rising into the very sky, a living monument to the refusal to accept natural limits. As the moon continues its arc across the night sky, the ruins of Babylon stand as testament to both the heights of human achievement and the inevitability of decline. Somewhere in this landscape of memory and dust, the question persists: what did they build here? What impossible beauty rose from these desert sands? The first voices to speak of the Hanging Gardens came from Greek historians writing centuries after Babylon's as greatest glory had faded. They wrote as travelers in a foreign land, attempting to describe wonders that challenged their understanding of what was possible. Strabo, the geographer, painted pictures with words terraces rising in tiers, each level supported by vaulted chambers and columns, the entire structure resembling a green mountain thrust up from the desert floor. Imagine standing in the dusty streets of ancient Babylon, the heat pressing down like a physical weight, and suddenly encountering this vision. A massive structure, perhaps 75 feet high or more, its terraces planted with trees whose roots had to punch down through multiple levels to find soil. Palm trees swaying in the breeze at heights where normally only birds would nest. Fig trees heavy with fruit, growing from what appeared to be solid stone. Grapevines cascading down walls in purple profusion, their tendrils seeking purchase on brick and mortar. The ancient accounts speak of the gardens with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Philo of Byzantium, writing his list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, described gardens that seemed to float in air, suspended by some architectural magic that allowed massive trees to flourish high above the ground. He wrote of walking beneath these elevated terraces, of looking up through layers of vegetation to see leaves backlit by the Mesopotamian sun, creating patterns of light and shadow that transformed stone into something alive and breathing. But how could such a thing exist? The engineering challenges alone seemed insurmountable even by modern standards. Trees need soil, and soil is heavy, extraordinarily heavy, when saturated with the water necessary to keep plants alive in a desert climate. The weight of just the soil required for such plantings would have been immense, requiring foundations and support structures of exceptional strength. And beyond the issue of weight lay the problem of waterproofing. Water would need to be present constantly, yet it could not be allowed to seep through and weaken the structural elements that held these tons of earth and vegetation aloft. The Greeks, who had their own architectural marvels, seemed genuinely impressed by what they heard about the Hanging Gardens. This suggests something remarkable, for these were people familiar with the Parthenon, with temples of exquisite proportion and technical brilliance. Yet the idea of a vertical garden, of bringing the chaos and organic wildness of nature under such complete control, apparently struck them as uniquely extraordinary. Diodorus Siculus, another ancient historian, provided perhaps the most detailed description. He spoke of gardens constructed on terraces, supported by stone pillars, each level coated with layers of materials designed to prevent water damage, reeds laid with asphalt, then double layers of baked brick bonded with gypsum, all topped with sheets of lead to ensure waterproofing. Upon this foundation, soil was piled deep enough to accommodate the largest trees, creating the impression of a natural landscape lifted impossibly into the air. The image these accounts create is almost surreal, a negation of gravity, a reversal of the natural order where plants cling to the earth. Instead, here was earth raised up, held aloft by human will and engineering prowess, supporting not just decorative flowers, but substantial trees, creating shade and coolness in a climate defined by sun and heat. Water, so precious in this arid land, would have flowed in abundance through these elevated gardens, a display of wealth and power as much as beauty. As descriptions, they fire the imagination. As historical documents, they raise as many questions as they answer. For while multiple ancient writers spoke of the Hanging Gardens, describing them with varying degrees of detail and wonder, not one of them claimed to have seen them personally. They were always writing about something they had heard of, a marvel reported by others, a wonder that existed in testimony but not in direct observation. Still, the consistency of the accounts suggests something real lay behind the legend. Too many sources, from too many different cultural backgrounds, described essentially the same marvel-elevated gardens, ingenious irrigation, a green mountain in the desert for the entire thing to be pure fabrication. Something extraordinary had existed in Babylon, or perhaps near Babylon, or at least in the collective memory of the ancient world. Something that transformed the relationship between earth and sky, between stone and living green, between what nature allowed and what human ambition could achieve. Every grand monument needs an origin story, and the Hanging Gardens possessed one of the ancient world's most romantic. The tale centers on King Nebuchadnezzar II, one of Babylon's most powerful rulers, who reigned in the 6th century, before the Common Era. Under his leadership, Babylon reached heights of military might and architectural splendor that would define it in historical memory. But for all his conquests and constructions, he is remembered most for what he allegedly built for love. The story goes that Nebuchadnezzar married Amethyst, a princess from the land of Media, a mountainous region to the northeast, where green hills rolled endlessly and rain fell with generous regularity. Media was a land of forests and meadows, of streams tumbling down rocky slopes and wildflowers carpeting the highlands in spring. For a woman raised in such abundance of natural beauty, Babylon, for all its grandeur, must have seemed harsh and alien. The flat desert landscape, the relentless sun, the dust that worked its way into everything, the absence of those green horizons she had known since childhood. According to legend, Amethyst grew melancholy in her new home. She wandered the great palace, surrounded by luxury and attended by servants, yet homesick for the hills and valleys of her youth. She missed the sound of wind through mountain trees, the sight of clouds catching on distant peaks, the smell of rain-soaked earth and pine. Nebuchadnezzar, observing his wife's sadness and loving her deeply, resolved to give her a gift that would ease her longing. If she missed the mountains, he would build her mountains. If she yearned for green hills, he would create green hills in the heart of Babylon itself. Thus, according to the romantic tradition, the Hanging Gardens came into being, an act of love translated into architecture, homesickness transformed into engineering challenge. The king commanded the most brilliant minds in his empire to design something unprecedented, a structure that would recreate the green mountainsides of Media in the middle of the Mesopotamian plain. No expense was to be spared, no difficulty considered insurmountable. Trees would be brought from distant lands, rare plants collected from across the empire, water systems devised that could maintain this impossible oasis. The story resonates because it speaks to universal human experiences: love, longing, the desire to ease the suffering of someone we care for. It transforms the Hanging Gardens from a mere display of wealth and power into something more intimate and poignant. They become not just architecture, but communication, a king's way of saying to his queen, "I see your pain, and I will move heaven and earth to ease it." In this narrative, the gardens transcend their physical form to become symbol of devotion, of the lengths to which love might drive us, of the attempt to recreate paradise for someone who has lost theirs. Yet, as with so much about the Hanging Gardens, the romantic story raises questions even as it captivates. The primary source for this tale is Josephus, a Jewish historian writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, centuries after the supposed construction of the gardens. Earlier sources that mention the gardens make no reference to Amadis or to the motivation of homesickness. The silence is curious. If such a romantic story were widely known and believed in the ancient world, why would earlier historians have omitted such a compelling detail? Some scholars suggest the story may be a later addition, a narrative flourish that emerged as the historical reality of the gardens faded into legend. Human nature loves a love story, after all, and the tale of a powerful king building an impossible marvel to comfort his homesick wife is irresistibly appealing. It adds emotional resonance to architectural triumph, giving purpose and pathos to what might otherwise be merely an expression of imperial hubris. Others point out that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Perhaps the connection to Amadis was always known, but simply not recorded in the sources that survived. Ancient historians often focused on political and military matters, considering personal relationships less worthy of detailed recording. The gardens may well have been built for the queen, with this motivation being common knowledge that didn't require explicit documentation. Regardless of the historical truth, the story of Nebuchadnezzar and Amadis has become inseparable from the Hanging Gardens in popular imagination. It transforms them from cold stone and calculated engineering into something warmer, a monument to the human heart's capacity for devotion, to the desire to create beauty not for its own sake or for public glory, but as a gift to ease another's sorrow. In this version, the gardens become paradise, recreated not in the biblical sense of humanity's lost innocence, but in the personal sense of one woman's lost home, recovered through the determination of a king who refused to let her grieve alone. As the night deepens over Babylon's ruins, the story lingers in the imagination. Whether true or not, it speaks to something essential about why we build, why we create, why we push beyond the practical into the realm of the extraordinary. Sometimes the greatest achievements spring not from ambition or pride, but from love from the simple, profound desire to make someone else happy, to give them a glimpse of the paradise they've lost. The romance fades, and the engineering challenge emerges stark and unforgiving. Set aside love and longing for a moment, and confront the practical impossibility of what the Hanging Gardens represented. How do you make a desert bloom not just at ground level where irrigation channels can be dug and maintained with relative ease, but 75 feet in the air on platforms of stone that should by all rights be as barren as the moon? The first and most fundamental challenge is water. Plants, particularly the substantial trees described in ancient accounts, require constant moisture. In Babylon's climate, where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit and rain was scarce, evaporation would have been rapid and relentless. The amount of water needed to maintain such gardens would have been enormous, hundreds, perhaps thousands of gallons daily. And this water would need to be lifted from the Euphrates River or underground wells to the highest terraces, fighting gravity every inch of the way. The ancient accounts mention various mechanisms for achieving this. Some sources describe a chain pump system, a continuous loop of buckets attached to a wheel, powered either by slaves or animals walking in circles, endlessly lifting water from the river to the upper levels. Others mention screws devices attributed to Archimedes, though possibly invented much earlier in Mesopotamia, that could raise water through a rotating helical surface inside a cylinder. Both technologies were possible in the ancient world, and both would have required significant effort to maintain constant operation. But moving the water to height was only the first challenge. Once there, it needed to be distributed throughout the gardens without causing structural damage. Water is destructive to architecture. It seeps into cracks, erodes mortar, undermines foundations. The Babylonians would have needed sophisticated waterproofing techniques to prevent their green mountain from becoming a crumbling ruin within a few seasons. The description from Diodorus Siculus of multiple layers of different materials suggests they understood this: reeds and asphalt, baked brick and gypsum, sheets of lead creating barriers against moisture penetration. Then there's the matter of soil. Trees with root systems deep enough to anchor them against wind and provide adequate nutrients would require substantial depth of earth, several feet at minimum. Soil, when saturated with water, becomes extraordinarily heavy. Modern engineers calculate that waterlogged earth can weigh upward of 120 pounds per cubic foot. Multiply that by the volume needed for an entire terrace of gardens, then multiply again by the number of levels, and the weight becomes staggering, potentially thousands of tons pressing down on whatever structure supported it. This means the foundations and support system would have needed to be incredibly robust. The ancient architects couldn't simply stack terraces on top of each other. They needed to create something with the load-bearing capacity of a solid pyramid, but with the yaws, hollowness necessary for water systems, storage chambers, and possibly living spaces. The engineering required would rival anything else attempted in the ancient world, comparable in ambition to the Egyptian pyramids, though entirely different in purpose and form. And beyond the technical challenges lay the practical ones. Where would the Babylonians source the variety of plants described in the accounts? Palm trees were native and available, but many of the species mentioned in various descriptions, cedar, cypress, certain fruit trees, would need to be imported from considerable distances. This would require not just initial acquisition, but ongoing replacement, as not every transplanted specimen would survive the shock of relocation or the peculiarities of growing in artificial soil high above the ground. The maintenance alone would have been an immense undertaking. Imagine the army of gardeners required climbing the levels daily to prune, to check for disease, to replace failed plants, to assure the irrigation systems remained clear and functional. Imagine the engineers constantly monitoring the structure for signs of water damage, for settling or shifting that might presage catastrophic collapse. The hanging gardens, if they existed, would not have been a one-time construction project, but an ongoing commitment of resources, labor, and attention that would have strained even Babylon's considerable wealth. Some scholars, confronting these challenges, have suggested that perhaps the ancient descriptions were exaggerated. Maybe the gardens were impressive, but not quite as grand as the legends suggest. Perhaps they were ground-level gardens with some raised elements, beautiful and well irrigated, but not truly hanging in the dramatic sense. This would solve many of the engineering problems, while still accounting for why ancient writers found them remarkable enough to celebrate. But this explanation, practical as it is, somehow diminishes the magic. The hanging gardens captured imagination precisely because they seemed impossible, because they represented humanity's refusal to accept the limitations imposed by nature and physics. A merely impressive garden wouldn't have earned a place among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, competing for recognition alongside the pyramids and the Colossus of Rhodes. Whatever the Babylonians built, or whatever the ancient world believed they built, it had to be extraordinary, had to push past the boundaries of the easily achievable into the realm where engineering becomes art and architecture becomes poetry. The stones themselves shouldn't have been able to grow green. Brick and mortar, no matter how skillfully arranged, remain fundamentally inanimate, fundamentally opposed to the organic chaos of living things. Yet, if the accounts are to be believed, the Babylonians found a way to reconcile these opposites, to create a space where stone supported life, where the geometric precision of architecture merged with the wild growth of nature. They transformed impossibility into reality, or at least into a legend so powerful that millennia later, we're still trying to understand how they might have done it. Pause for a moment in the grand narrative of kings and kingdoms, of engineering triumphs and architectural mysteries, and consider something smaller, more intimate, the bricks themselves. Babylon was built of clay, pressed into molds and baked hard under the Mesopotamian sun, or in kilns that transformed earth into something approaching stone. Millions upon millions of these bricks went into the city's construction, into its walls, its temples, its streets. And on these bricks, sometimes, there are marks. Not just the stamps of kings declaring their building projects, though these exist in abundance. Each brick bearing Nebuchadnezzar's boast in cuneiform script, "I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon." But also other marks, smaller, more personal, the fingerprints of the workers who shaped the clay, who pressed it into molds, who carried it to the walls. These fingerprints have survived millennia. You can see them still, preserved in museums, on bricks recovered from Babylon's ruins. The whorls and ridges are clear, unmistakable, a direct physical connection to individuals who lived more than 2,500 years ago. We don't know their names, we'll never know their stories, but we can see the evidence of their hands, their labor, their momentary contact with wet clay that would outlast their lives by countless generations. Among the thousands of inscribed tablets recovered from Babylon, some contain records that might relate to the Hanging Gardens. Inventory lists mentioning exotic plants, references to water lifting equipment, notes about maintenance of the Palace Garden or the Hanging Garden, though the translations are ambiguous, and scholars debate whether these refer to the legendary wonder or simply to more conventional royal gardens. One tablet, fragmented and difficult to interpret, seems to describe repairs to a garden terrace, including notes about waterproofing materials. Another mentions the cost of transporting large trees, though the destination is unclear. These are not dramatic revelations, not the clear historical evidence that would definitively prove the garden's existence. They are whispers, hints, a kind of mundane bureaucratic records that accumulate around any large construction project, but which rarely capture the imagination. Yet there's something poignant about these clay fragments with their pressed cuneiform characters. They represent the daily reality behind the legend, the practical considerations of workers and administrators, dealing with the challenges of maintaining something extraordinary. If the Hanging Gardens existed, they weren't just a completed marvel to be admired. They were an ongoing project requiring constant attention, generating paperwork and problems, and the tedious details that never make it into the grand historical narratives. The fingerprints on the bricks whisper their own story. They remind us that everything we call architecture, everything we celebrate as monument or wonder, was built by human hands. Somewhere in Babylon's ruins might lie bricks that were part of the Hanging Gardens, carrying the fingerprints of workers who moved earth and placed stone to create something that defied nature. They worked in heat and dust, probably for little pay, likely without any sense that they were contributing to something that would be remembered millennia later as one of the great wonders of the ancient world. These bricks, with their silent testimony, bridge the gap between legend and reality in a way that grand historical accounts cannot. They are physical, tangible, real objects that can be touched and measured and scientifically analyzed. Yet they remain tantalizingly ambiguous, refusing to answer the questions we most want to ask. Were you part of the Hanging Gardens? Did the hands that left these prints help build the impossible Green Mountain? Or are you simply one of millions of ordinary bricks from an extraordinary city? Your connection to the legend, nothing more than proximity and coincidence? The city's ruins keep their secrets well. The bricks continue their whispered testimony, saying everything and nothing, preserving the touch of long-dead hands while remaining silent about the structures those hands created. To understand what the Babylonians might have achieved with the Hanging Gardens, consider what they demonstrably did accomplish. This was not a culture struggling with basic technology, puzzling out rudimentary solutions to simple problems. The Babylonians were masters of their environment, having spent centuries developing sophisticated techniques for surviving and thriving in one of the world's most challenging landscapes. Their mastery began with water. In a land where rainfall was insufficient for agriculture, They created extensive irrigation networks that transformed desert into farmland. Canals stretched for miles, carefully graded to ensure water flowed at the correct speed, fast enough to prevent stagnation and mosquito breeding, slow enough to avoid erosion. Control gates allowed farmers to direct water precisely where needed. Reservoirs stored excess water from flood seasons for use during dry months. The entire system required continuous maintenance and sophisticated understanding of hydraulics, of how water behaves under various conditions, of the relationship between gradient and flow rate. But the Babylonians' engineering prowess extended far beyond simple water management. They constructed ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids that dominated city skylines and served as temples, astronomical observatories, and symbols of the connection between earth and heaven. The most famous, the Etemenanki, the probable inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel, rose nearly 300 feet high. Building such structures required advanced mathematics, understanding of load distribution, knowledge of material properties, and sophisticated organizational capacity to coordinate the labor of thousands of workers. The city walls themselves represented engineering achievement of the highest order. Ancient accounts describe walls wide enough to accommodate chariot racing, towering high enough to deter any enemy, extending long enough to encompass an entire metropolis. The brick production alone would have been an industrial undertaking of staggering scale. Estimates suggest tens of millions of bricks went into Babylon's fortifications. Each brick needed to be formed, dried, fired, transported, and placed according to plans that required surveying, measuring, and geometric precision. Then there was their astronomical knowledge. The Babylonians tracked celestial movements with remarkable accuracy, developing mathematical models that could predict planetary positions, lunar phases, and eclipses. Their base 60 number system, remnants of which survive in our 60-minute hours, and 60-second minutes allowed for calculations of extraordinary precision. They understood periodicity, could recognize patterns in celestial behavior, and used this knowledge not just for religious purposes, but for practical applications like calendar making and agricultural planning. This same culture that could predict eclipses and build walls that stood for centuries would have approached the challenge of the Hanging Gardens with both vision and technical capability. The engineering problems, while formidable, were not necessarily beyond their abilities. They understood water management, structural load distribution, waterproofing techniques, and the organization of labor on massive scales. If any ancient civilization possessed the technical knowledge to build hanging gardens, it was the Babylonians. Consider the problem of raising water to height. The Babylonian solution, whether chain pumps or sprue pumps, demonstrated understanding of mechanical advantage and continuous motion. These weren't simple devices, but sophisticated machines that could operate reliably over extended periods. The fact that such mechanisms are mentioned in multiple ancient accounts suggests they were real, well-known technologies rather than speculative fantasies. The waterproofing techniques described by ancient historians, multiple layers of different materials creating barriers against moisture, aligning with what we know of Babylonian construction methods. They understood that different materials have different properties, that combining them in specific sequences could produce results superior to any single material. They used bitumen, a naturally occurring petroleum product abundant in the region, as waterproofing and adhesive. They created specialized bricks fired to different hardnesses for different purposes. They developed mortar formulas that could withstand moisture better than ordinary mud. The structural challenges of supporting tons of soil and vegetation high above the ground would have been significant, but not necessarily insurmountable. The same principles that allowed them to build ziggurats distributing weight through multiple levels, using internal chambers to reduce overall mass while maintaining strength, careful attention to foundation design could have been applied to the gardens. The structure wouldn't have been solid, but rather a sophisticated framework, strong where strength was needed, hollow where weight needed to be minimized. What emerges from examining Babylonian technical capabilities is a culture that delighted in pushing boundaries, in demonstrating mastery over their environment through both practical and symbolic means. They didn't just build structures. They built statements. The walls said, "We are secure, powerful, able to defend what we've created." The ziggurats said, "We can reach toward the heavens, bridge the gap between human and divine." The irrigation system said, "We will make the desert bloom through ingenuity and effort." In this context, the Hanging Gardens make perfect sense as the logical extension of everything the Babylonians valued and excelled at. They would represent the ultimate synthesis: water management, structural engineering, agricultural knowledge, aesthetic vision, and symbolic meaning, all combined into a single unprecedented achievement. They would be the Babylonians' way of declaring not just that they could survive in the desert, but that they could create paradise there, that no environmental challenge was too great for human ingenuity to overcome. Whether the gardens existed as described or were something less grand, but still remarkable, they fit perfectly into the pattern of Babylonian achievement. This was a culture that looked at their harsh environment and refused to accept its limitations, that transformed themselves from desert survivors into builders of marvels that would inspire all millennia later. Here the mystery deepens, taking an unexpected turn. For all the ancient descriptions, for all the confident declarations that the Hanging Gardens ranked among the world's greatest wonders, there exists a peculiar problem. No one seems entirely certain where they were. The assumption has long been that they stood in Babylon, built by Nebuchadnezzar II, located somewhere within or adjacent to the Great Palace Complex. But archaeological excavations of Babylon, conducted intermittently over more than a century, have failed to find any convincing evidence of the gardens. The German archaeologist Robert Kohl-Dewey, who conducted extensive excavations at Babylon in the early 20th century, believed he had found them. He identified a structure with unusual features: thick walls that could have supported great weight, a chamber that might have housed water-lifting equipment, a location near the Euphrates that would have facilitated irrigation. His interpretation was reasonable, but other archaeologists remained unconvinced. The structure could easily have served other purposes, and nothing about it definitively suggested the elaborate terraced gardens described by ancient historians. Since Kohl-Dewey's time, numerous excavations have continued to examine Babylon's ruins. Modern techniques, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, systematic surveying have mapped the ancient city with increasing precision. Yet the Hanging Gardens remain elusive. No foundations clearly designed to support the weight of elevated terraces filled with soil. No elaborate waterworks on the scale that would have been necessary. No distinct archaeological signature saying, "Here, this is where the impossible Green Mountain stood." This absence of evidence has led some scholars to a radical reconsideration. Perhaps the gardens weren't in Babylon at all. Perhaps the Greek historians who wrote about them centuries after their supposed construction had their facts wrong, conflating stories or misattributing achievements to the wrong city. Perhaps the real location of this wonder has been hiding in plain sight, just not in the place everyone has been looking. In 1993, Dr. Stephanie Daly, an Assyriologist at Oxford University, proposed a provocative alternative. She suggested the Hanging Gardens were actually in Nineveh, the ancient capital of Assyria, some 300 miles north of Babylon. The gardens, she argued, were built not by Nebuchadnezzar II, but by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who ruled more than a century earlier. And rather than being a romantic gift to a homesick queen, they were a demonstration of Assyrian engineering prowess and imperial power. The evidence Daly assembled is intriguing. Sennacherib left extensive inscriptions describing his accomplishments, and among them are detailed accounts of a magnificent garden he created at Nineveh. He described bringing water from distant mountains through a system of canals and aqueducts, some incorporating the first known use of the architectural arch for a substantial span. He boasted of planting the garden with trees, and plants from throughout his empire, creating a wonder for all peoples. Most tellingly, Sennacherib specifically described his irrigation system as raising water to the garden using a screw, the same mechanism mentioned in Greek accounts of the Hanging Gardens. He even included reliefs showing his garden, depicting what appeared to be elevated structures with plants growing at multiple levels. The technical details in his inscriptions align remarkably well with the descriptions provided by Greek historians when discussing the Hanging Gardens. If Bali is correct, the mystery of the missing gardens resolves itself neatly. They haven't been found in Babylon because they were never there. Greek historians, writing centuries after the fact, based their accounts on earlier records that may not have clearly distinguished between different Mesopotamian cities. To Greek readers, Babylon might have served as a general term for the great cities of the ancient Near East, much as Hollywood today can refer broadly to the American film industry, regardless of specific geographic location. The theory has sparked considerable debate among scholars. Some find the evidence compelling, pointing out that Sennacherib's detailed descriptions and the archaeological evidence at Nineveh provide a more solid foundation than anything found at Babylon. Others remain skeptical, noting that the Greek sources quite specifically mention Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, and that requiring such a significant error on the part of multiple ancient historians seems presumptuous. What is fascinating about this geographical mystery is how it highlights the fundamental uncertainty surrounding even famous historical landmarks. We assume that something as significant as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world would have a clear, indisputable historical record. Yet centuries can obscure even the grandest achievements. Details get confused, stories migrate from one context to another, and what begins as accurate reportage gradually transforms into something else through repeated retelling and cultural transmission. The desert that surrounds both Babylon and Nineveh cares nothing for human certainty. The sand that has buried both cities makes no distinction between Assyrian and Babylonian achievements. Perhaps the Hanging Gardens stood in Babylon, and we simply haven't found them yet. Perhaps they graced Nineveh, and the Greeks got the location wrong. Or perhaps, and this possibility haunts the investigation like a ghost, they never existed at all as a physical structure, but rather as an amalgamation of various gardens and engineering marvels, merged in cultural memory into a single legendary wonder. The question remains open, an invitation to continued investigation. The ruins of both cities still hold secrets beneath centuries of accumulated earth and debris. Each new excavation season brings the possibility of discovery, of that moment when a researcher's brush uncovers something unmistakable, something that finally answers the question that has persisted for millennia. Where were the Hanging Gardens? Among the artifacts recovered from Nineveh is a clay cylinder covered with cuneiform script, now housed in the British Museum. It's not a particularly impressive object at first glance, just a few inches long, brown and weathered, the kind of ancient artifact that might easily be overlooked in a collection filled with more visually striking pieces. But the words pressed into its surface tell a story that challenges everything traditionally believed about the Hanging Gardens. The cylinder records the accomplishments of King Sennacherib, specifically detailing his construction projects at Nineveh. In the king's own words, translated from Akkadian, he describes creating a garden like the Amanus Mountains, a mountain range in southern Turkey famous for its forests and beauty. He explains bringing water from distant sources through elaborate engineering, constructing canals and aqueducts that stretched for miles. He boasts of the variety of plants collected for his garden: cotton, vines, olives, exotic trees from various regions of his empire. Most remarkably, Sennacherib describes the mechanism used to raise water to his elevated garden. I raised the height of the surroundings of the palace to be a spectacle for all peoples. I made a marsh and planted a reed thicket therein. I let the waters of the garden overflow into the marsh, and herons nested there. I had water channels made to water the garden, and by means of copper screws, I made water flow into these canals, copper screws raising water. This detail is electrifying for anyone familiar with the traditional accounts of the Hanging Gardens, because Strabo specifically mentions a screw as the mechanism used to irrigate them. The Archimedes screw, as it came to be known, is usually associated with the Greek mathematician who lived centuries after Sennacherib. Yet here is an Assyrian king describing the same technology, using it for the same purpose, lifting water to elevated gardens, more than 100 years before Nebuchadnezzar II ruled Babylon. The cylinder goes on to describe the garden's magnificence, how it became renowned throughout the region, how visitors came from distant lands to marvel at what had been created. A wonder for all people is the phrase used strikingly similar to language later applied to the Hanging Gardens by Greek historians. Dr. Stephanie Daly, who brought this cylinder to prominence in her theory about the garden's true location, points out that Sennacherib's descriptions provide far more technical detail than anything in the Greek accounts. He's not writing legend or hearsay. He's inscribing an official royal record, meant to be preserved for posterity, detailing what he accomplished. And what he describes sounds remarkably like what the Greeks later attributed to Babylon. The reliefs from Sennacherib's palace provide additional evidence. Carved stone panels show what appears to be an elevated garden with trees, supported by columns arranged in the distinctive arch formation that Sennacherib pioneered. The architectural style matches the archaeological evidence found at Nineveh. Water channels are visible in the reliefs, along with the aqueduct system that brought water from mountain sources miles away. If these inscriptions and reliefs do indeed describe the legendary Hanging Gardens, then the confusion in Greek sources becomes understandable. By the time Herodotus and other Greek historians were traveling through Mesopotamia, Nineveh had been destroyed, conquered by a coalition that included Babylon. The gardens, if they survived at all, would have been in ruins. The stories about them might have become detached from their precise geographic and historical context, attributed to the more famous city of Babylon rather than to the conquered Assyrian capital. There's a certain poetry in this possibility that the Hanging Gardens, if they were indeed in Nineveh, became Babylonian in memory, as Babylon itself became the symbol for all of Mesopotamian civilization in the Greek imagination. The actual engineering triumph of an Assyrian king would have been absorbed into the legendary accomplishments of Babylon, just as Nineveh itself was absorbed into the empire that destroyed it. The clay cylinder sits in its museum case, its surface still bearing the clear impressions of ancient script. It represents a voice from the past, a king speaking across millennia, insisting on the truth of his achievements. Whether that truth resolves the mystery of the Hanging Gardens or merely adds another layer of complexity to it remains a matter of scholarly debate. But the cylinder stands as tangible evidence that somewhere in Mesopotamia, in either Babylon or Nineveh, or perhaps in both, ancient engineers accomplished something remarkable with water stone and living green, something extraordinary enough to echo through history, whatever its precise location may have been. Step back from the debate over specific locations and specific kings and consider a different possibility entirely. What if the Hanging Gardens were never a single place at all? What if they were, instead, an idea that moved through culture and time, accumulating details and associations as they went, becoming more legend than location, more concept than concrete reality? The ancient Near East was home to many gardens, many engineering marvels, many attempts to create green paradises in desert environments. The Persians developed the concept of the asterisk, paradisa asterisk, an enclosed park or garden, from which our word paradise derives. They created elaborate walled gardens with geometrically arranged plantings, water features, and exotic species collected from throughout their vast empire. The Assyrians, as Sennacherib's inscriptions demonstrate, built magnificent elevated gardens. The Babylonians themselves certainly had royal gardens of some kind, even if not the specific wonder described by Greek historians. Perhaps what the Greeks encountered in their travels and readings was not a single garden, but a composite picture drawn from multiple sources. A traveler might hear about Sennacherib's elevated garden at Nineveh, with its sophisticated water-raising mechanism. Another account might describe Nebuchadnezzar's palace gardens in Babylon, luxurious and beautifully maintained. A third story might tell of Persian walled paradises with exotic plants from dozens of different climates. In the retelling, these separate marvels could merge. The water screw from Nineveh, the terraced construction from one place, the exotic plants from another, the romantic motivation from a third source, all combining into a single legendary garden that was more wondrous than any real place could have been. This process of mythological accretion is well documented in other contexts. Many legendary locations and events represent amalgamations of multiple historical realities, combined and enhanced through repeated storytelling until they become something both more and less than their original inspiration. Consider how this might have happened practically. A Greek historian in the 5th century BC might have access to older written accounts, now lost to us. He might interview travelers who had been to Mesopotamia. He might examine artwork and hear stories that had been passed down through generations. From these fragmentary sources, he would construct a narrative, trying to piece together a coherent picture of something he hadn't personally witnessed. In the process, details from different gardens, different cities, different time periods might blur together, creating a composite that no single ancient gardener would recognize as their work. This theory has the advantage of explaining why the Hanging Gardens are so difficult to pin down archaeologically. If they weren't a single structure, but rather a cultural memory of multiple structures, then looking for the specific location becomes futile. The real Hanging Gardens would be scattered across multiple sites, their features distributed among various Mesopotamian cities and time periods. No single excavation could ever uncover them, because they never existed as a single, unified physical entity. It also explains the variations in ancient accounts. Different historians describe slightly different features, different dimensions, different specific details. If they were drawing from different sources describing different gardens, these inconsistencies make perfect sense. The Hanging Gardens would be like a myth that exists in multiple versions, each telling slightly different but recognizably similar stories. There's something both disappointing and liberating about this possibility. Disappointing because it means there may be no single location to discover, no moment of archaeological triumph when researchers can definitively say, "Here, we found them." The mystery would resolve into a recognition that we were asking the wrong question all along, not, "Where were the Hanging Gardens?" but which gardens contributed to the legend of the Hanging Gardens? Yet it is also liberating because it reframes the Hanging Gardens as something more enduring than stone and earth. If they were an idea rather than a place, then they can never be destroyed. Empires may fall, cities may crumble to dust, but an idea, particularly an idea about beauty, about human ambition, about the possibility of creating paradise, can survive millennia intact. The Hanging Gardens would become a cultural dream, a shared vision of what humanity might achieve when it combines technical skill with aesthetic vision, practical engineering with impractical beauty. This interpretation also fits with how other ancient wonders have survived in cultural memory. The Colossus of Rhodes was destroyed by earthquake, but the idea of the Colossus, a massive statue dominating a harbor, lives on. The lighthouse of Alexandria collapsed centuries ago, yet it remains a symbol of technological achievement and the desire to guide travelers safely home. These wonders persist not as physical objects, but as concepts that capture something essential about human aspiration. Perhaps the Hanging Gardens work the same way. They represent the dream of conquering the desert, of making barren places bloom, of defying natural limits through ingenuity. They symbolize love's power to move mountains, or at least to build them artificially. They stand for the possibility that paradise is not something lost in the past or deferred to an afterlife, but something that can be constructed right here, right now, with sufficient will and skill. In this reading, asking whether the Hanging Gardens really existed misses the point. They exist in the most important sense, as an inspiration, as a goal, as a reminder of what we might achieve. They are gardens that move not just through space, from Nineveh to Babylon in the confusion of historical memory, but through time and culture, from ancient Mesopotamia to the present day, gathering meaning and significance with each retelling. The moon continues its arc across the night sky, illuminating ruins that might or might not have held the legendary gardens. But perhaps it doesn't matter. Perhaps the true location of the Hanging Gardens is not in any particular patch of Iraqi desert, but in the human imagination, where they grow more vivid and more beautiful with each passing century, watered by wonder and tended by the refusal to let such beauty be forgotten. The modern city of Hilla sprawls across the ruins of ancient Babylon, its buildings and streets overlaying millennia of buried history. The Euphrates River still flows nearby, though its course has shifted over the centuries, no longer tracing quite the same path it followed when Nebuchadnezzar ruled. The landscape is flat, agricultural, dotted with irrigation works that would be familiar to ancient Babylonian farmers. And beneath it all, sometimes just a few feet below the surface, sometimes much deeper, lie the remnants of one of history's greatest cities. Archaeological work at Babylon has been sporadic and, at times, destructive. The German excavations of the early 20th century were groundbreaking for their time, but by modern standards, crude. Much material was removed without proper documentation. Later excavations in the 1970s and 1980s under Saddam Hussein's regime reconstructed portions of Babylon, but these reconstructions, built directly atop ancient remains, have made it difficult for archaeologists to distinguish between ancient and modern construction. Military activity during the Iraq War caused additional damage, with portions of the site used as a military base, heavy vehicles driving over archaeological layers, trenches dug through ancient structures. What archaeologists have found, despite these challenges, is extraordinary, just not conclusive regarding the Hanging Gardens. The Ishtar Gate has been partially reconstructed, its glazed blue bricks decorated with yellow and white reliefs of bulls and dragons gleaming as they once did when Babylonian kings processed through them. The outline of Nebuchadnezzar's palace is visible, its foundations and ground plan discernible, even when walls have crumbled. Street patterns, residential quarters, temple complexes, all these have been mapped and studied. But the elaborate terraced structure described in ancient accounts, with its sophisticated water-lifting mechanisms and foundations designed to support tons of soil and vegetation, this has not definitively appeared. Coldwey's candidate structure remains ambiguous. Other possible locations have been proposed, examined, and found wanting. The Great Green Mountain seems to have vanished, if indeed it ever stood in Babylon at all. The frustration archaeologists feel is palpable in their published reports. Here is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, described by multiple ancient sources, supposedly located in a city that has been extensively excavated, yet it remains elusive. Part of the problem is the nature of archaeological work itself. Unlike in movies where discoveries happen suddenly and completely, real archaeology is painstaking, incremental, and often inconclusive. A wall foundation might serve multiple purposes. A water channel could be for gardens, or for drinking water, or for defensive moats. Without clear contextual evidence, inscriptions specifically identifying a structure as the Hanging Gardens, for example, interpretation remains uncertain. There's also the problem of preservation. If the gardens existed and were built primarily of fired brick with wooden structural elements, much might have deteriorated beyond recognition. Wood rots, especially in environments with fluctuating water tables. Bricks can be recycled, taken from older structures to build newer ones, a common practice throughout ancient history. The foundations might survive, but without the superstructure, it could be difficult to understand what the foundations once supported. The water table at Babylon has risen significantly over the centuries, a consequence of irrigation practices and the accumulation of silt-raising ground levels. This means portions of ancient Babylon are now below the water table, making excavation extremely difficult. The Hanging Gardens, if they existed, and if they were in a low-lying area near the river for easy access to water, might now be submerged in groundwater, effectively sealed from investigation without massive pumping operations. Political instability in Iraq has also hampered research. The decades since the Gulf War have seen limited international archaeological work. Iraqi archaeologists have continued as they can, but resources are scarce, and preservation takes priority over new excavation. The site is also enormous ancient Babylon, covered several square miles. Systematic excavation of even a fraction of it would require decades and funding on a scale that's difficult to justify given competing priorities. And yet, the absence of evidence, frustrating as it is, doesn't equal evidence of absence. Babylon's ruins extend deep, layer upon layer of occupation spanning centuries. New discoveries remain possible. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technologies continue to improve, offering ways to explore beneath the surface without the destructive necessity of excavation. Each year brings technical advances that might finally reveal what has remained hidden. The silence of the ruins is itself a kind of testimony. Babylon speaks eloquently of its grandeur through the scale of its walls, the sophistication of its urban planning, the beauty of its decorative arts. But it speaks in fragments, in half-told stories, in monuments whose purposes sometimes remain mysterious. The Hanging Gardens, if they were here, maintain their mystery perfectly in this context. They become one more chapter in Babylon's complex relationship with history present enough to be remembered, absent enough to be doubted, significant enough that we keep searching, even after centuries of failure, to find definitive proof. As the excavations continue, as new technologies are applied and new areas explored, hope persists. Perhaps someday a researcher will brush away dust from a stone inscription that clearly identifies the Hanging Gardens location. Perhaps an archival discovery will unearth an ancient map or document that provides the missing clue. Or perhaps the mystery will remain, Babylon keeping this one secret despite revealing so many others, the desert and the dust claiming their privilege to hold something back, to remind us that not all questions have answers waiting to be found. The desert is both the most faithful and most treacherous of archivists. It preserves with remarkable fidelity organic materials that would rot within years in humid climates, could last millennia in the arid environment of Mesopotamia. Ancient papyrus, delicate textiles, even dried foods have been recovered intact from desert sites. The dryness prevents decay, mummifying the past, holding it suspended in a kind of stasis. Yet the desert also destroys with patient brutality. Sand, driven by wind, acts as an abrasive, wearing away stone, eroding reliefs until they become illegible, reducing monuments to abstract shapes. The temperature extremes, scorching days, and cold nights cause materials to expand and contract, fracturing stone and crumbling mortar. Flash floods, rare but devastating, can wash away what survived thousands of years of steady erosion in a matter of hours. This dual nature creates a peculiar archaeological landscape. Some things survive in astonishing detail inscriptions, sharp enough to read despite being thousands of years old. Glassware intact, building foundations preserved with their original dimensions clearly visible. Other structures, equally well built, have vanished almost completely, leaving only faint traces detectable only through the most sensitive instruments or the trained eyes of experienced archaeologists. If the Hanging Gardens existed in Babylon, they would have faced this dual nature of desert preservation and destruction. Their foundations, if built of fired brick and stone, might survive in recognizable form. But the terraces themselves, with their layers of waterproofing materials, their soil and vegetation, their complex water systems, these could have degraded beyond recognition. Organic matter would have vanished. Lead sheeting might have been valuable enough to be salvaged and recycled in later periods. Timber structural elements would have rotted or burned long ago. The water systems, ironically, might have contributed to the garden's destruction. If maintenance ceased after Babylon's decline and conquest, for example, water that once nourished plants would begin to damage structure. Channels would overflow or leak. Water would seep into places it was meant to be excluded from, undermining foundations, washing away mortar, creating erosion from within. A garden that depended on meticulous maintenance might collapse relatively quickly once that maintenance stopped. And then the sand would come, as it always does. The desert is patient, always pressing at the edges of human habitation, ready to reclaim what has been temporarily taken from it. Without constant effort to push it back, sand accumulates. First a thin layer, easily disturbed. Then more, gradually burying what stands. Over centuries, entire cities can vanish beneath the sand, their monuments becoming low hills that betray no hint of the architecture they conceal. This process of burial is paradoxically both destructive and preservative. The sand protects what it buries from wind erosion and temperature extremes. But it also adds weight, crushing structures beneath its increasing load. Water, when it does come in the form of rare rains or floods, percolates through the sand, carrying dissolved salts that crystallize in the pores of brick and stone, slowly fragmenting them from within. The Euphrates River adds its own layer of complication. Rivers meander, changing their courses over time, cutting new channels and abandoning old ones. Areas that were once riverbank might now be miles from water. Sediment deposited by annual floods raises ground levels, burying older surfaces beneath layers of silt. The stratigraphy becomes complex. Archaeologists, digging down through time, encounter not a simple sequence of older and younger, but a palimpsest where flooding has interrupted sequences, where erosion has removed portions of the record, where later construction has disturbed earlier layers. If the Hanging Gardens stood near the river, as most theories suggest, they would have for convenient access to water, then they would have been particularly vulnerable to these processes. A shift in the river's course might have left them high and dry, making maintenance impossible. A major flood might have undermined their foundations or buried them under meters of silt in a single season. Or they might have been gradually worn away, a process so slow that no single generation noticed the decline, but which, over centuries, reduced grandeur to rubble. The desert remembers, but it remembers in its own way. It doesn't preserve clearly and obviously like a museum. It scrambles the record, mixing destruction with preservation, offering tantalizing hints while withholding conclusive evidence. An archaeologist working in Mesopotamia must become a detective, assembling a case from fragmentary clues, always aware that critical evidence might have vanished, that the clearest proof might be forever beyond reach, dissolved by water, blown away by wind, or simply lying just beyond the edge of the current excavation. This is the context in which the search for the Hanging Gardens takes place. Not a simple question of digging in the right spot, but a complex negotiation with a landscape that reveals its secrets reluctantly, that demands patience and insight, and a willingness to accept uncertainty. The desert holds the memory of Babylon, but like all memories, it's incomplete, selective, subject to distortion by the passage of time. What it remembers of the Hanging Gardens remains, for now, locked beneath sand and silence. In the 1960s, during excavations near the Ishtar Gate in Babylon, archaeologists made an unusual discovery. Mixed with the debris of ancient building collapse, preserved in conditions that had kept them dormant for millennia, were seeds. Not just ordinary seeds from common plants, but date palm seeds of a variety that appeared to be extinct, along with traces of other botanical material that suggested deliberate cultivation of diverse species in an area that, by the time of excavation, supported little more than scrub grass and hardy desert plants. Seeds can survive extraordinary lengths of time if conditions are right. The dry environment of Mesopotamia is nearly ideal for preservation, lacking the moisture that would cause germination or rot. The seeds could remain viable for centuries, even millennia. What made these particular seeds noteworthy was their context and variety. They weren't randomly scattered by wild plants, but appeared to be associated with human agricultural or horticultural activity on an unusual scale. Some of the seeds came from plants not native to Mesopotamia. Their presence suggested importation from considerable distances, from mountain regions to the north and east, from Mediterranean coastal areas, perhaps from as far as India. This kind of botanical diversity wasn't typical of ordinary agriculture, which focused on staple crops grown extensively, rather than rare species collected from distant lands. It was, however, exactly what one might expect from a royal garden designed to impress, to demonstrate the reach of empire, to bring together plants from every corner of the known world. Date palm seeds were particularly interesting. The date palm has been cultivated in Mesopotamia for thousands of years, providing not just fruit, but also materials for construction, shade, and symbolic meaning in both religious and secular contexts. But ancient texts refer to numerous varieties of date palms, each with slightly different characteristics. Many of these varieties have been lost, replaced by more productive or resilient cultivars, the old genetic lines vanishing as agricultural practices evolved. One seed, recovered and carefully stored, was eventually germinated by Israeli researchers in 2005 as part of a project to revive ancient plant varieties. The date palm that grew from this 2,000-year-old seed, nicknamed Methuselah, after the biblical figure known for longevity, proved viable and even eventually produced fruit. Its DNA was subtly different from modern date palm cultivars, representing a genetic heritage that had been preserved in dormancy while the world changed around it. The seed gave scientists a direct biological connection to the ancient world, confirming that the plants mentioned in historical texts were real, that the agricultural and horticultural practices described were actual, not mythical. If such seeds survived near Babylon's gates and processional ways, what might be found in areas specifically devoted to gardening? What botanical archive might lie beneath the sands, waiting for the right conditions to reveal their secrets? The traces of exotic plants near the ancient canals of Babylon add another piece to the puzzle. While not definitive proof of the Hanging Gardens after all, any royal palace would have had decorative gardens of some kind. They confirm that Babylon cultivated plants from diverse geographic origins. The infrastructure existed for bringing in specimens from distant lands, for maintaining species that required more water or different soil conditions than the local environment naturally provided. There's something poignant about these seeds. They represent potential, the possibility of life, of growth, of blooming, suspended in time. For millennia, they waited, containing within their dry husks all the genetic information necessary to create roots and stems and leaves and fruit, lacking only the moisture and warmth to trigger that transformation. They're a perfect metaphor for the Hanging Gardens themselves, potential made dormant by time, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal what they once were. Botanical archaeology is a growing field, applying increasingly sophisticated techniques to recover and analyze ancient plant remains. Pollen grains, too small to see with the naked eye but remarkably resistant to decay, can survive in sediments, providing evidence of what plants grew in an area centuries or millennia ago. Phytoliths, microscopic silica structures produced by plants, survive, even when all other organic material has vanished, leaving a kind of botanical fingerprint. Applied to the question of the Hanging Gardens, these techniques could potentially provide evidence that wouldn't require finding the garden's physical structure. If terraced gardens existed in Babylon, they would have created a distinct botanical signature, concentrations of pollen from exotic species, phytoliths from plants that didn't naturally grow in the region, soil chemistry showing sustained irrigation and organic amendment. This signature would persist in sediments, offering indirect but compelling evidence of horticultural activity on an unusual scale. The ancient seeds speak across time, carrying messages written in DNA and cell structure. They confirm that Babylon was indeed a place where the desert was made to bloom, where human will imposed order and beauty on an environment that naturally resisted both. Whether they grew in the legendary Hanging Gardens or in some other royal garden, they testify to the same impulse, the desire to create paradise, to gather beauty from distant places and concentrate it in one extraordinary location, to demonstrate that with sufficient knowledge and resources, even the most exotic plants could be made to thrive where nature said they should not. The Babylonians were not merely practical people, solving the problems of daily survival in a challenging environment. They were mystics and mathematicians, priests and poets, people who saw the cosmos as a unified whole, where the movements of celestial bodies reflected and influenced events on Earth. Their astronomy was inseparable from their astrology, their engineering from their theology. Everything they built carried both practical and symbolic meaning, functioning simultaneously in the physical and spiritual realms. Consider their ziggurats, the massive stepped pyramids that dominated Mesopotamian cities. These weren't simply temples or observation platforms, though they served both functions. They were representations of the cosmic mountain, the axis mundi where heaven and earth met. Each level corresponded to a sphere of existence, a realm of gods or planets or principles. Climbing the ziggurat was a spiritual as well as physical ascent, moving from the earthly realm progressively closer to the divine. In this context, could the Hanging Gardens, if they existed, have been purely aesthetic? Or would they too have carried layers of symbolic meaning, their physical structure encoding spiritual truths and astronomical knowledge? Several scholars have suggested that the gardens might have functioned as a three-dimensional representation of Babylonian cosmology, each terrace corresponding to a celestial sphere, the plants carefully selected not just for beauty, but for their associations with particular deities or planets. Babylonian astronomy divided the sky into paths: the path of Anu in the equatorial region, a path of Enlil to the north, a path of Aa to the south. These paths were populated by constellations and wandering planets, each associated with particular gods and qualities. If the gardens were designed according to this cosmological framework, their terraces might have mirrored these divisions, with plants chosen to represent different celestial regions. The concept isn't as far-fetched as it might initially seem. The Babylonians were capable of extraordinary astronomical precision. They tracked planetary positions, understood the periodicity of eclipses, developed mathematical models that could predict celestial events years in advance. They associated specific plants with particular deities, the date palm with various fertility gods, the cedar with mountain deities, the tamarisk with purification and boundaries. A garden designed to encode cosmological information would be entirely consistent with their worldview and technical capabilities. Water, in this symbolic system, would represent the Apsu, the primordial freshwater ocean that underlay the earth in Babylonian mythology. The mechanism that raised water from the Euphrates to the upper terraces would then symbolize the connection between earthly and cosmic waters, between the mundane and the sacred. The very act of making water flow upward against its nature would represent the power of divine order to organize chaos, to impose structure on the formless. Trees growing at height, their roots in soil held suspended above ground level, would symbolize the world tree, a concept found in many ancient mythologies, representing the connection between underworld, earth, and heaven. The central tree in a ziggurat garden wouldn't just be decorative, but would serve as a living embodiment of cosmic structure, its branches reaching skyward, while its roots remained grounded its trunk, marking the axis around which the world turned. Even the layout of the gardens could encode astronomical information. If the terraces were oriented to cardinal directions, if plantings marked significant astronomical alignments, If the structure's proportions reflected important mathematical ratios discovered through celestial observation, then the gardens would function as a kind of three-dimensional astronomical textbook. Walking through them would be not just aesthetically pleasing, but pedagogically significant, each view revealing some truth about cosmic order. This interpretation transforms the Hanging Gardens from a simple display of wealth and engineering prowess into something far more profound, a sacred space where multiple meanings converged. They would be simultaneously an engineering marvel, an aesthetic achievement, a romantic gesture, and a spiritual statement. They would assert that Babylon stood at the center of cosmic order, that its king had the power to reorganize even the fundamental relationships between earth and sky, water and stone, life and architecture. Modern visitors to archaeological sites sometimes forget that ancient peoples didn't separate science from religion, practicality from symbolism in the ways we do. A structure could be fully functional and deeply symbolic simultaneously. The canals that brought water to Babylonian fields were engineering works, but they also represented the civilizing power of kingship, the triumph of order over chaos. The walls that protected the city were military installations, but they also defined sacred space, separating the organized world within from the chaos without. If the Hanging Gardens existed, they would have operated on multiple levels of meaning. A foreign visitor might see them as impressive evidence of Babylonian engineering and wealth. A Babylonian priest would see them as a three-dimensional mandala, a representation of cosmic structure. A common citizen might appreciate their beauty while also understanding them as a statement about the divine authority of the king. A homesick queen might find in them a reminder of distant mountains, while Babylonian astronomers used them to demonstrate celestial principles to students. The night sky above ancient Babylon blazed with stars undimmed by light pollution, the Milky Way a glowing river across the dome of heaven. The Babylonians watched these skies with patience and precision, recording observations, detecting patterns, developing understanding. If they built gardens that reached toward those stars, it's worth asking whether they were simply reaching upward or whether they were building downward from heaven, creating on earth a reflection of what they saw written in the movements of celestial bodies. The question adds yet another layer to the mystery. Were the Hanging Gardens, perhaps, not meant to be understood through archaeology alone, but through astronomy as well? Could their location, orientation, structure, and plantings encode information that would not be visible to modern researchers, looking only for foundations and water channels? Might they have been, in essence, a cosmic diagram made manifest in earth and water and living green? In the Babylonian worldview, the distinction between sacred and secular was thin to the point of non-existence. Every aspect of life connected to the divine, every human activity resonated in celestial realms. The king wasn't just a political leader, but a mediator between gods and mortals. The city wasn't merely an administrative center, but a sacred precinct. And the greatest architectural works weren't simply impressive buildings, but attempts to bridge the gap between human and divine, between the earth below and the heavens above. The Edamananki, Babylon's great ziggurat, embodied this aspiration perfectly. Its name meant foundation of heaven and earth, and it was conceived as exactly that, the point where the two realms met, where gods could descend to earth and humans could ascend toward the divine. Ancient texts describe it as having 7 levels, each painted a different color, each associated with one of the classical planets known to Babylonian astronomers. The temple at its summit was dedicated to Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, and was said to contain a bed where the god would rest during sacred marriage rituals. The ziggurat rose nearly 300 feet, dominating the cityscape, visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. It was a mountain built by human hands, an artificial peak in a land without natural heights. And it served not just religious, but political purposes. It announced Babylon's power, its ability to mobilize resources and labor on a massive scale, its king's special relationship with the divine. Now consider the hanging gardens, if they existed in this same context. They too would represent an attempt to transcend natural limits, to create something that shouldn't exist in a desert environment. But where the ziggurat reached upward toward heaven, the gardens would bring heaven's bounty downward to earth. The ziggurat was stone and brick, unchanging and eternal. The gardens would be living and growing, cyclic and renewable. Together, they might represent complementary aspects of cosmic order, the eternal and the temporal, the unchanging and the transformative, masculine and feminine principles in cosmic balance. The ziggurat and the gardens, as cosmic siblings, would create a symbolic landscape around Babylon's palace complex. The king would dwell between them, between earth and heaven, between stone permanence and living change. Approaching the palace, a visitor would encounter these dual monuments, each impressive in entirely different ways, each communicating messages about power and divine favor and civilization's capacity to reshape nature. There's evidence that Babylonian kings thought deeply about their building projects' symbolic meanings. Inscriptions describe architectural works in terms that blur practical and spiritual significance. Nebuchadnezzar's building texts speak of creating wonder, of demonstrating divine favor, of surpassing the achievements of predecessors. The language suggests something beyond mere construction. These were acts of cosmic significance, participating in the ongoing work of maintaining universal order. In this framework, the hanging gardens would be more than beautiful, more than impressive, more than evidence of engineering skill. They would be theology made manifest. They would demonstrate that Babylon's king, with divine support, could command not just humans, but nature itself. He could make water flow upward, make trees grow where there was only stone, create abundance where there should be scarcity. This was the kind of power associated with gods, and by exercising it, the king affirmed his special status as divine representative on earth. The garden as sacred space has deep roots in Mesopotamian tradition. The earliest Sumerian texts speak of gardens in association with temples, describing them as meeting places between human and divine. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero encounters a garden of jeweled trees at the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. Gardens were thresholds, liminal spaces where the usual rules didn't fully apply, where transformation became possible. Creating such a space in the heart of Babylon would consecrate the city, marking it as extraordinary among all human settlements. The gardens would be a permanent offering, a living prayer, a demonstration of proper relationship between human and divine realms. Water flowing upward might symbolize prayer rising to heaven. Plants from distant lands gathering in one place might represent the unity of empire under divine order. The terrace structure climbing skyward might symbolize the path of spiritual ascent. We tend to think of ancient monuments in purely material terms: tons of stone, hours of labor, technical challenges overcome. But for the people who built them, these structures were alive with meaning. They weren't just buildings, but statements of faith, exercises in theology, arguments about the nature of reality and humanity's place within cosmic order. The engineering precision wasn't separate from spiritual significance, but was itself an expression of religious devotion. To build accurately was to honor divine order, to demonstrate that human works could reflect heavenly perfection. If the Hanging Garden stood near the Etemenanki, these two monuments would create a powerful symbolic dyad. Stone and vegetation, unchanging and growing, earth reaching toward heaven, and heaven's blessings descending to earth. Together, they would proclaim that Babylon stood at the center of the world, that its king had achieved harmony with cosmic forces, that the city functioned as it was meant to, as a sacred center where human and divine, natural and constructed, mortal and eternal existed in balanced tension. The temple nature of such structures helps explain why they might leave little archaeological trace. Sacred spaces require maintenance, but when maintenance ceases, when empires fall, when populations scatter, when new religions replace old sacred structures, can be systematically dismantled. Materials might be removed for reuse elsewhere. Sites might be deliberately destroyed to eliminate competing religious claims. Or they might simply be abandoned, left to decay without the continual care that kept them functioning. The earth was a temple, in the Babylonian view, and everything built upon it participated in sacred reality. The Hanging Gardens, whether they stood in Babylon or Nineveh, or existed only in cultural memory, represented this understanding perfectly. They were an act of worship as much as construction, an offering of beauty presented to gods, and humans alike, a statement that the divine order could be made visible through sufficient devotion, knowledge, and effort. Water in Mesopotamia was never simply water. It was life and death, creation and destruction, the fundamental force that made civilization possible while constantly threatening to wash it away. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which gave Mesopotamia its name, the land between the rivers, were unpredictable in their moods. Annual flooding was expected, even essential, depositing the rich silt that made agriculture possible. But periodically, the floods came with exceptional violence, overwhelming defenses, sweeping away structures, drowning fields and settlements. The Mesopotamian consciousness was shaped by this dual nature of water. Their mythology reflected it in stories of the great flood narratives that predated the biblical account of Noah by millennia. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains the story of Utnapishtim, who survived a divinely ordained deluge by building a boat, preserving life so that the world could begin again after destruction. These stories weren't abstract mythology, but expressions of lived experience, cultural memory of actual catastrophic floods that had devastated the region. Yet water was also renewal, fertility, the essential element without which nothing could grow. The same floods that destroyed also renewed, clearing away the accumulated detritus of previous years, depositing fresh soil, resetting the agricultural cycle. Death and rebirth were inseparable, two phases of an endless cycle that defined existence in the ancient Near East. The Hanging Gardens in this context take on additional symbolic resonance. They would represent ultimate control over water, not just prevention of destruction through levees and drainage, but transformation of water into beauty, its incorporation into a structure designed to demonstrate mastery rather than submission. Water would flow where humans directed it, nourishing what they chose to plant, ascending against its nature to serve human aesthetic and symbolic purposes. There might be an even deeper connection between the gardens and flood mythology. Some scholars have suggested that legends of Paradise Gardens Eden in the biblical tradition, similar concepts in other cultures, represent cultural memory of the time before major climate shifts, when portions of Mesopotamia were more naturally fertile, when rain was more abundant, when working the land required less struggle against environmental challenges. Archaeological and geological evidence indicates that the Middle East experienced significant climate changes in prehistoric periods. Areas that are now desert once supported more diverse vegetation. Rivers flowed that have long since vanished. Conditions that would make garden building less necessary once existed naturally. The Paradise Gardens of mythology might echo this lost abundance, representing cultural longing for a time when the land itself was garden-like, before desertification and climate shift made survival a constant challenge. In this reading, the Hanging Gardens would be an attempt to recreate paradise, not just spatially, but temporally, to bring back, through human effort, the natural abundance that once existed, but had been lost to climate change and environmental degradation. They would be an act of defiance against loss, a refusal to accept diminishment, an insistence that what was once given by nature could now be achieved through engineering and will. The cycle of flood and bloom, destruction and renewal, connects to the broader pattern of Mesopotamian civilization itself. Cities rose and fell, empires emerged and collapsed, dynasties succeeded one another. Each period of chaos eventually gave way to new order, new construction, new achievements. The Babylonians built on the ruins of Assyrians, who had built on the ruins of earlier Sumerian cities. Cultural memory extended back thousands of years, a consciousness of depth in time that shaped how they thought about their place in history. The Hanging Gardens, rising from this civilization, shaped by cycles of destruction and renewal, would embody the principle that human achievement can survive catastrophe. Beauty can be recreated after devastation. Order can emerge from chaos. What flood washes away, determination can rebuild. The gardens would be both monument and manifesto, proclaiming that Babylon had not merely survived the vicissitudes of history, but had transcended them, creating something so magnificent that it would be remembered even if when the inevitable next cycle of destruction came. There's a poignant irony in this. If the Hanging Gardens existed and were indeed destroyed by some combination of conquest, neglect, environmental change, and time's patient erosion, they would perfectly exemplify the very cycle they were meant to transcend. The flood, whether literal or metaphorical, eventually claims everything. The desert reclaims what was taken from it. Stone crumbles, gardens wither, empires fall. The dream of permanence meets the reality of impermanence, yet the legend survives. Long after any physical structure has vanished, the idea of the Hanging Gardens persists, passed down through generations, translated into dozens of languages, adapted and reimagined by cultures far removed from ancient Mesopotamia. In this sense, the gardens achieved a kind of immortality that transcends physical survival. They became myth, and myths, paradoxically, can be more enduring than monuments. The flood and the bloom, destruction and creation remain locked in eternal cycle. But perhaps the point was never to escape the cycle, but to participate in it fully, to create beauty knowing it will not last forever, to build gardens aware that floods will eventually come. The meaning lies not in permanence, but in the act of creation itself, in the refusal to let harsh reality have the final word about what is possible. The Euphrates still flows through Iraq, as it has for millennia, still flooding in spring, still depositing silt, still giving life while occasionally taking it. Somewhere in its path, perhaps, the Hanging Gardens once stood, a green assertion against brown desert, a claim that humans could partner with water rather than merely suffering its presence. Whether that claim was vindicated by lasting achievement or undermined by eventual destruction, the attempt itself remains worth remembering, worth celebrating, worth puzzling over in the quiet hours of archaeological investigation and imaginative reconstruction. Babylon was never just a physical place. It was also perhaps primarily a state of mind, a collection of ideas and aspirations that happened to take architectural form. This was a city of dreamers, of people who looked at their harsh environment and saw not limitation but possibility. They were priests mapping the heavens, mathematicians working out equations, engineers designing water systems, poets composing epics that would survive millennia. They were administrators developing legal codes, merchants facilitating trade networks spanning continents, artisans creating works of startling beauty. The Babylonians inherited the cultural legacy of the Sumerians, who had essentially invented civilization in its organized form: cities, writing, complex administrative systems, monumental architecture. But Babylon refined these inheritances, adding sophistication and scale. Their astronomical observations were more precise, their mathematics more advanced, their engineering more ambitious. They took the foundation laid by earlier cultures and built something that would define Babylon as a concept extending far beyond the physical city. In later tradition, Babylon became a symbol sometimes of wisdom and achievement, sometimes of excess and corruption, but always of something exceptional, something that transcended ordinary human experience. Biblical writers portrayed it as both marvel and warning. Greek historians described it with wonder tinged with unease. Islamic scholars preserved and built upon Babylonian astronomical and mathematical discoveries. The name Babylon entered multiple languages as shorthand for urban sophistication, for cosmopolitanism, for the heights and dangers of human ambition. The Hanging Gardens, whether they existed or not, perfectly embody Babylon as concept rather than merely as place. They represent the Babylonian impulse to refuse natural limits, to envision what shouldn't be possible and then make it real. They capture the combination of practical engineering and impossible beauty that characterized Babylonian achievement at its height. And they persist in imagination because they exemplify something essential about what Babylon meant, a place where humans dared to dream grandly and had the technical capacity to realize those dreams. Consider the personality that might conceive of hanging gardens. It would be someone familiar with how things are, but unwilling to accept that limitations are permanent. Someone who looks at flat desert and thinks, what if there were mountains here? Someone who observes that water flows downhill and thinks, how might we make it flow upward? Someone who knows that trees require deep roots in earth, but asks, can we provide earth at height? This personality, curious, ambitious, creative, technically capable, describes the Babylonian intellectual class at its best. These were people who questioned, experimented, calculated, and built. They developed astronomy not just for religious purposes, but from genuine curiosity about how the universe worked. They refined mathematics not only for practical applications, like surveying and commerce, but for the abstract beauty of numerical relationships. They built monumental architecture, not just to house institutions or impress enemies, but to push the boundaries of what was possible. The gardens, in this context, would be the ultimate Babylonian achievement, combining all their strengths in service of a single magnificent vision. Engineering, aesthetics, botany, water management, mathematics, astronomy, symbolic thinking, practical organization, and poetic imagination all coming together in one structure. They would be less a garden than a manifesto, a declaration that the human capacity for dream and design had no necessary limits. But there's a shadow side to this reading, one that later interpreters of Babylon have often emphasized. The same ambition that creates marvels can become hubris. The same technical capability that builds wonders can be turned to warfare and domination. The same organizational skill that administers a great city can oppress subject peoples. The same wealth that allows for hanging gardens exists because of taxation and tribute extracted from conquered territories. Babylon was an empire, its splendor funded by the labor and resources of peoples brought under its control through military force. The Hanging Gardens, if built, would have required not just engineering genius, but also immense material resources and human labor. How many workers shaped bricks, carried water, dug foundations? How many craftsmen spent years on the project? How much tribute from how many subjugated peoples funded this display of imperial power? The biblical writers certainly saw this darker aspect. The book of Daniel portrays Nebuchadnezzar as a powerful but flawed king whose hubris leads to temporary madness. Babylon in Revelation becomes a symbol of worldly corruption. The very achievements that inspired wonder also inspired moral critique. How dare humans reach so high, claim so much, build so grandly? Yet there's something distinctly human about this combination of aspiration and overreach, creation and destruction, beauty and violence. Civilizations are always complex, containing contradictions that resist simple judgment. The same culture that developed sophisticated legal codes also waged brutal wars. The same king who might have built gardens for his homesick wife also destroyed Jerusalem and exiled its population. History contains multitudes refusing to sort neatly into heroes and villains. The dreamer city dreamed with eyes open and closed open to practical realities, closed to the word impossible. It was a place where the gap between imagination and achievement could be bridged through sufficient knowledge, effort, and resources. The Hanging Gardens, hovering between confirmed history and persistent legend, remain the perfect emblem of Babylon's identity, a dream realized so completely that it transcended physical existence to become an immortal idea. As the modern world looks back at Babylon across the gulf of millennia, what emerges is not a simple picture, but a complex portrait of human possibility in all its dimensions. The capacity to create something as extraordinary as the Hanging Gardens, if they existed. The ambition to attempt such a thing, even if they didn't fully succeed. The imagination to conceive of them. The technical skill to make the attempt plausible. And the meaning-making drive to ensure that even if the physical structure vanished, the legend would persist, would continue to inspire wonder and curiosity, and that most Babylonian of questions. How might we do the impossible? In 323 BCE, Alexander the Great entered Babylon. He was 32 years old and had conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India, from Egypt to Central Asia. He had defeated the Persian Empire, captured its capitals, proclaimed himself king of Asia. He was, by any measure, the most powerful person alive, a military genius whose tactical innovations would be studied for millennia. And he came to Babylon not as a conqueror, the city had submitted without resistance, but as something like a pilgrim, drawn to a place whose reputation had fascinated him since childhood. The Babylon Alexander encountered was past its peak, but still magnificent. Nebuchadnezzar had died more than 2.5 centuries earlier, and the city had endured conquest by the Persians, changing hands and political fortunes. But its walls still stood, the Ishtar Gate still gleamed, and the great ziggurat still dominated the skyline. And according to several ancient sources, the Hanging Gardens still existed, though perhaps showing signs of age and reduced maintenance. Ancient historians record that Alexander was struck by the garden's beauty and engineering. Some accounts suggest he spent considerable time there, appreciating the coolness and shade they provided during the brutal Mesopotamian summer. He reportedly planned extensive renovations and new construction projects in Babylon, intending to make it a capital of his new empire, a meeting place between Greek and Eastern cultures. But Alexander never completed these plans. Within weeks of arriving in Babylon, he fell ill with a fever. Ancient accounts of his final days describe him declining rapidly despite his robust constitution. Modern scholars have speculated about the cause: malaria, typhoid, poisoning, or some other malady, but the exact cause remains uncertain. What is certain is that Alexander died in Babylon in June 323 E, his world-spanning empire suddenly rudderless, his grand plans for Babylon's future unrealized. The symbolism is almost too perfect. The young conqueror who had seemed unstoppable, who had pushed past the boundaries of the known world, died in a city famous for reaching toward heaven through its architecture. He died in the same place where legendary gardens defied nature, where ancient kings had demonstrated that human will could reshape reality. If the gardens were indeed visible from the palace where Alexander spent his final days, he would have looked upon them as his strength failed, a reminder that even the most impressive achievements are temporary, that every empire falls, that ambition always eventually meets limitation. There's a tradition, impossible to verify but evocative, that Alexander specifically asked to be brought to see the Hanging Gardens during his final illness. The story suggests he wanted to look upon them once more, to remind himself of what human beings could achieve even in the face of harsh reality. If true, it would add another layer to the garden's meaning, not just a symbol of imperial power or romantic devotion, but a meditation on mortality and achievement, a reminder that beauty endures even as individual lives end. Alexander's death in Babylon marked a turning point in the city's history. His generals divided his empire among themselves, and Babylon became a prize fought over in the Wars of the Diadochi. The city experienced periods of revival and decline, changing hands repeatedly. The great projects Alexander had planned: restoration of temples, clearing of canals, new construction, were never completed. Babylon began a long, slow decline from capital of empire to provincial center to ruins. If the Hanging Gardens survived into Alexander's time, they might not have survived much longer. The political instability following his death would have disrupted the maintenance such gardens required. The complex water systems would need constant attention, continuous repair, ongoing investment of resources and labor. Without a strong central authority committed to their upkeep, they would deteriorate quickly. Perhaps Alexander was the last major historical figure to see them in anything approaching their original glory. The connection between Alexander and the gardens has inspired countless artistic representations over the centuries. Paintings show the dying conqueror looking wistfully at green terraces. Poems imagine his thoughts as he contemplates the impermanence of human achievement. Novels and historical fictions elaborate meetings between Alexander and imagined gardeners or engineers. Discussions about how the gardens were built and maintained. These representations, like the gardens themselves, exist in the space between history and legend, using known facts as a foundation for imaginative elaboration. What's particularly striking is how Alexander himself a borderline mythical figure. His life elaborated by legend until the historical person becomes difficult to distinguish from the heroic archetype becomes associated. With the Hanging Gardens, equally legendary, equally uncertain in historical specifics. Two mysteries intertwined, two symbols of human ambition meeting in the ancient city that embodied both achievement and transience. The tradition that Alexander saw and admired the gardens, whether strictly accurate or not, serves an important function in the legend's transmission. It provides a link between Babylonian and Greek traditions, a moment when Western and Eastern cultures intersect. It gives the gardens a witness whose credibility and fame could carry their reputation forward into Hellenistic and Roman times. And it adds pathos, the greatest conqueror of the age, who had overcome every military challenge, undone by illness in the shadow of gardens that represented humanity's victory over natural limits. As the moon rises over Babylon's ruins, it illuminates the spot where Alexander died, the place where one of history's most famous lives ended. Whether the Hanging Gardens stood nearby, whether his eyes rested on them during his final days, whether they provided any comfort or merely served as another reminder of mortality, these questions remain open, adding one more layer to the mystery that refuses resolution. The Euphrates has flowed through Mesopotamia for thousands of years, though not always in the same channel or at the same volume. Rivers are living things in their way, responding to rainfall in distant mountains, to climate shifts, to human interventions. The Euphrates that waters Iraq today follows a somewhat different path than it did in Babylonian times, its banks higher or lower, its flow constrained by modern dams and irrigation works that would astound ancient engineers even as the basic principles remain familiar. This river was the lifeline for ancient Babylon. It provided water for drinking, for irrigation, for the elaborate canal system that spread fertility across the agricultural plain. It was a highway for transportation, bringing goods and people from distant regions. It was a boundary and a bridge, a barrier to enemies, and a connection to the wider world. Without the Euphrates, Babylon would never have existed. The river made everything possible. But the river was also dangerous. Its floods could be devastating, arriving with sudden violence, overwhelming defenses built during more optimistic seasons. The river could change course, a process called avulsion, where the main channel shifts to a new location, abandoning the old path and leaving communities that depended on river access suddenly isolated. Channels could silt up, requiring constant dredging to maintain navigability. Upstream wars or natural disasters could affect water flow hundreds of miles downstream, creating unpredictability that no amount of local engineering could fully control. If the Hanging Gardens existed in Babylon, they would have depended completely on the river's proximity and relative stability. The water to supply them would come from the Euphrates, lifted by mechanical means to the upper terraces. Their location would need to be close enough to the river for this to be practical, but not so close that they risked flood damage during high water seasons. It would be a delicate balance, requiring careful planning and ongoing adjustment as conditions changed. Some scholars have suggested that changes in the Euphrates course might explain why the Hanging Gardens haven't been found archaeologically. If the river shifted after the garden's abandonment, the structure might now be in an unexpected location relative to other known features of Babylon. Alternatively, if the gardens were partially destroyed by flooding and their ruins washed downstream, the archaeological signature might be scattered or buried under later sediment deposits. The river deposits as much as it erodes, building up layers of silt year after year, gradually raising the level of the floodplain. This process means that ancient Babylon lies beneath meters of accumulated sediment in many areas. Features at ground level in Nebuchadnezzar's time might now be buried 10 or 15 feet down, covered by centuries of flood deposits and wind-blown sand. The Hanging Gardens could be down there, preserved beneath protective layers of silt, waiting for archaeologists to dig deep enough in the right location. But the river giveth, and the river taketh away. For every area where it deposits protective sediment, there's an area where erosion cuts through ancient layers, washing them away, destroying in moments what survived for millennia. If the gardens were in the path of a channel shift, or subject to particularly violent flooding, they might have been damaged beyond recognition or physically dismantled by the river's force. Their materials scattered across the floodplain, their structure reduced to ambiguous fragments. There's a kind of poetry in the idea that the Euphrates, which made the Hanging Gardens possible, might also have erased them. Water gives life to gardens, but too much water destroys. The same element that was carefully managed and controlled to create beauty in the desert might, when released from human control, have reclaimed what humanity had temporarily taken from nature. The gardens would return to the river in this scenario, completing a cycle: water to plant to ruin to sediment, carried downstream to delta to sea. The Mesopotamians were deeply aware of this dual nature. Their flood myths reflect it. Their engineering demonstrates respect for water's power, even as they worked to control it. The canals they built required constant maintenance, not just because of silting and leakage, but because the river was always trying to reclaim its natural freedom, to escape the constraints imposed on it, to flow where gravity and geology directed, rather than where human needs demanded. In modern Iraq, the Euphrates faces new challenges. Upstream dams in Turkey and Syria control flow for hydroelectric power and irrigation, reducing the water that reaches Iraq. Climate change affects rainfall patterns in the mountains where the river originates. Agricultural practices have led to salinization of soils, making some historically fertile areas less productive. The river remembers its ancient role as life-giver and destroyer, but now it must navigate a much more intensively managed landscape, its every fluctuation monitored and controlled. Local people still tell stories about the river, passed down through generations, mixing historical memory with mythology until the boundary between them blurs. Some stories speak of ancient gardens, of green places that once existed but vanished when the river changed its mind about its course. These stories might be garbled memories of the Hanging Gardens, or they might refer to other gardens, other losses. The river has claimed much over the millennia, and not all of it leaves clear traces. Archaeological teams sometimes use ancient river channels as guides, searching for sites along former banks, even when the current channel runs a different path. They look for telltale sediment patterns, for the kinds of deposits that indicate proximity to flowing water in ancient times. This approach has revealed numerous sites, uncovering structures and artifacts that had lain hidden for centuries. Perhaps somewhere along an ancient channel of the Euphrates, the foundations of the Hanging Gardens wait, their location marked by subtle variations in soil composition that trained eyes can detect. The river flows on, as it has always flowed, carrying water from distant mountains to the Persian Gulf, supporting life along its banks, occasionally rising in flood, sometimes dwindling to dangerous lows during drought years. It remembers everything and nothing, preserving some secrets in its sediments while washing others away. The Hanging Gardens, if they existed, were born from the river's water, and might have been claimed by it in the end one more chapter in the long story of humanity's complicated relationship with the waters that give life. The concept of a garden paradise didn't begin with Babylon, and it certainly didn't end there. The idea resonates across cultures and throughout history. A walled enclosure protecting beauty from the chaos beyond. A carefully ordered space of abundance and peace. A place where humans can experience harmony with nature and perhaps catch a glimpse of the divine. The hanging gardens, whether they physically existed or not, participate in this much larger tradition of paradise gardens that stretches from the ancient past into the present. The Persian word asterisk, paridesa asterisk, literally means walled around, and describe the elaborate royal parks created by Achaemenid rulers. These weren't wild spaces, but highly designed environments. Trees planted in geometric patterns, water channels running in straight lines, exotic animals kept in enclosures, plants gathered from throughout the empire. The Greeks borrowed the word, which eventually became paradise in English, carrying connotations not just of gardens, but of ideal existence, of perfection, of the relationship between humans and nature in its most harmonious form. The biblical Garden of Eden shares obvious thematic connections with these ancient Near Eastern paradise gardens. Eden was enclosed, protected, a place of abundance where humans lived in harmony with creation before the fall. It contained trees pleasant to the sight and good for food, with a river that divided into 4 branches, an obvious parallel to the irrigation systems of Mesopotamian gardens. The imagery in Genesis, most scholars agree, reflects the cultural context of ancient Mesopotamia, where gardens represented the highest achievement of human-nature collaboration. Islamic tradition developed the paradise garden concept extensively. The Quran describes paradise in garden terms: flowing streams, shade, abundant fruit, beauty without decay. This celestial model was recreated on earth in the formal gardens of Islamic architecture. The Alhambra in Spain, the Mughal gardens of India, the palace gardens of Persia all follow design principles that echo back to ancient Mesopotamian precedents. Geometric order, abundant water, carefully selected plantings, walls creating separation from the outside world, a sense of peaceful abundance. These elements recur across centuries and continents. The interesting question is whether the Hanging Gardens directly influenced this long tradition, or whether they and the tradition both spring from common roots. Did medieval Islamic garden designers look back to Babylon's legendary gardens as inspiration, or were they working from Persian and Roman precedents that happened to share common ancestry with the Babylonian tradition? The answer is probably both. The legend of the Hanging Gardens spread widely enough to influence later thinking, while the basic principles of paradise garden design emerged from practical and symbolic needs that multiple cultures discovered independently. Renaissance and later European gardens also engaged with these traditions. Italian Renaissance gardens with their terraces and water features, French formal gardens with their geometric precision, English landscape gardens with their carefully constructed, natural appearance all represent different interpretations of what a paradise garden should be. And when writers described these gardens, they often invoked Babylon, comparing contemporary achievements to the ancient wonder, suggesting that the Hanging Gardens had become a touchstone, a standard against which other gardens were measured. There's something deeply human about the paradise garden concept. In every climate and culture, people have created enclosed spaces of beauty, order, and abundance. In harsh environments, these become even more significant oases of green in deserts, walled gardens protecting delicate plants from harsh weather, spaces where the usual rules of survival are temporarily suspended in favor of aesthetic pleasure and spiritual peace. A garden becomes a statement that humans can create pockets of paradise even in an imperfect world. The Hanging Gardens, in this context, represent an extreme expression of this universal impulse. Not just a garden at ground level, but one lifted into the air, defying gravity, making vegetation float. Not just collected exotic plants, but an entire mountain made green. Not just careful irrigation, but water flowing upward against its nature. The gardens take the basic paradise garden concept and amplify it to legendary proportions, becoming less a real place than an ideal, the ultimate expression of what a garden could be if resources and engineering were unlimited. This might help explain why the gardens persist in imagination, even as their historical reality remains uncertain. They function as an archetype, a perfect expression of the paradise garden idea. Whether Nebuchadnezzar actually built them matters less than the fact that the story captures something people want to believe is possible. That beauty can triumph over harsh reality. That human ingenuity can create spaces where the natural limits seem not to apply. That paradise is something we can build, rather than something lost in the past or deferred to an afterlife. The echoes of paradise resonate through time, each culture creating its own version of the ideal garden, while remembering and invoking earlier versions. The Hanging Gardens occupy a special place in this tradition, the earliest famous example, the most impossible achievement, the most mysterious and least documented. They haunt the imagination of everyone who has ever tried to create beauty against difficult odds, who has ever planted a garden in a harsh climate, who has ever wondered whether the stories of ancient marvels might possibly be true. Perhaps this is their real immortality, not as archaeological remains, but as inspiration, as proof that humans have always dreamed of paradise, and sometimes, just possibly, have managed to build it. The Hanging Gardens bloom eternally in imagination, requiring no water or maintenance, immune to flood and conquest, more real as legend than they might ever have been, as stone and earth and living green. Modern archaeology is a scientific discipline. It requires careful measurement, systematic excavation, rigorous documentation, peer review, and evidence-based conclusions. This approach has revealed extraordinary insights about ancient civilizations, reconstructing their technologies, social structures, daily lives, and historical trajectories with impressive detail. The scientific method applied to the past has transformed our understanding of human history. But there's a tension between this scientific approach and the nature of the Hanging Gardens as legend. Science demands evidence foundations, artifacts, clear archaeological context, verifiable data. Legend requires only wonder, only the willingness to believe that extraordinary things might have existed. Science is skeptical by nature, questioning extraordinary claims, demanding proof proportional to the marvel being asserted. Legend is credulous by nature, accepting amazing stories, embellishing them in the retelling. The Hanging Gardens exist in this uncomfortable space between. There's enough ancient testimony to suggest something remarkable existed, but there's insufficient archaeological evidence to satisfy scientific rigor. For anyone approaching the question scientifically, the conclusion must be uncertain, possibly existed, but unproven. For anyone approaching it through wonder, the conclusion might be, the stories are too detailed, too consistent, too widely reported not to have some basis in reality. Perhaps the modern world, with its admirable commitment to evidence and verification, has lost something in the process. The ancient writers who described the Hanging Gardens were often trying to convey wonder, not to document historical fact with modern precision. When Strabo describes terraces climbing skyward, he's painting a word picture designed to make readers imagine something marvelous. When Philo lists the 7 wonders, he's creating a catalog of amazement, inviting readers to think about human achievement at its peaks. Reading these accounts with a modern mindset, we immediately start asking practical questions. How high exactly? How many terraces? What was the water flow rate? Where precisely were they located? These are good questions, important questions if we want to reconstruct historical reality. But they might miss what the original writers considered most important, the experience of wonder, the sense that humans had achieved something that seemed to transcend ordinary limits. There's a particular kind of loss when every mystery must be solved, when uncertainty becomes intolerable, when the only acceptable answer is a definitive one. The Hanging Gardens as unsolved mystery invite imagination, speculation, continued investigation. They remain alive in our thinking, precisely because they're not settled. If tomorrow archaeologists definitively identified their remains, the mystery would be solved, but something would also be lost. The gardens would become fact rather than legend, determined rather than open, settled rather than still unfolding. This isn't an argument against archaeological investigation. The search for evidence should continue. Technologies improve, techniques evolve, and what seemed impossible to discover in one generation might become accessible in the next. If the Hanging Gardens left any physical trace, modern and future archaeology might yet find it. But there's value in acknowledging that some questions might never be answered, that history contains mysteries that resist solution, that wonder has its own worth independent of verification. The ancient world understood this in ways modernity sometimes struggles with. They were comfortable with ambiguity, with stories that blurred history and myth, with accepting that some things were simply marvelous without demanding to know exactly how they worked. The Hanging Gardens could be appreciated as a wonder without a detailed engineering analysis, as a symbol of human achievement without concern for precise historical attribution. Perhaps we need both approaches, the scientific discipline that demands evidence and the imaginative openness that appreciates mystery. The gardens can be investigated archaeologically while also being celebrated as legend. We can admit that we don't know for certain whether they existed while still finding meaning and inspiration in the story. The tension between these approaches doesn't have to be resolved in favor of one or the other. What's certain is that the Hanging Gardens, existing somewhere between history and legend, continue to exercise a peculiar power over imagination. They appear in children's books and scholarly articles, in fantasy novels and engineering textbooks, in tourism materials and philosophical meditations. They've become a cultural reference point, shorthand for impossible beauty achieved through ingenuity. This cultural persistence suggests that the gardens serve a function beyond historical documentation. They represent something people need to believe is possible. The lost art of wonder is perhaps not entirely lost, but simply sleeping, waiting for the right story to awaken it. The Hanging Gardens provide such a story, beautiful, mysterious, frustratingly uncertain, eternally fascinating. They remind us that the past contains marvels that our ancestors achieved, extraordinary things that the relationship between humans and nature has always included, dreams of paradise, of abundance of green growing places that defy the limits imposed by geography and climate. In the end, perhaps the most important thing about the Hanging Gardens isn't whether we can prove they existed. It's that we want them to have existed, that we need stories of human achievement that transcend ordinary experience, that we require legends to reach toward, even if we never quite grasp them. The gardens bloom in imagination, because imagination needs garden spaces of beauty and order and life-giving green, especially when the world outside seems harsh and brown and unforgiving. Return to the beginning tonight over ancient Babylon, to moonlight on ruins, to the quiet that settles over the desert after the sun's heat finally releases its grip. The stars emerge, the same stars that Babylonian astronomers tracked with such precision, the same constellations that guided travelers and inspired stories, the same celestial patterns that seemed to hint at order underlying the apparent chaos of existence. Somewhere in this landscape, between what was and what might have been, the Hanging Gardens wait. They wait in the excavated trenches of archaeological digs, perhaps still buried beneath meters of sand and silt. They wait in ancient texts not yet fully translated or interpreted, their existence hinted at in ambiguous phrases that could mean everything or nothing. They wait in oral traditions that might preserve garbled memories of actual marvels. They wait in the collective imagination, more vivid in mental images than they might ever have been as physical structures. The question of their existence, which has preoccupied scholars for generations, seems less important in this moment of quiet contemplation. Perhaps they stood in Babylon, built by Nebuchadnezzar for his homesick queen. Perhaps they graced Nineveh, engineered by Sennacherib as a demonstration of Assyrian power. Perhaps they were many gardens in many places, merged by cultural memory into a single legend. Perhaps they never existed at all, except as a dream, as a story about what humans might achieve if will and skill and resources aligned. What matters is that the story survives, that the image of gardens hanging in the sky continues to captivate, that the idea of making deserts bloom through determination and ingenuity remains compelling. The hanging gardens, in all their mysterious uncertainty, represent human aspiration at its finest, the refusal to accept limits, the drive to create beauty where only barrenness should exist, the insistence that paradise is something to be built rather than something lost or deferred. If you were to stand in the ruins of Babylon tonight, under this canopy of stars, you might see nothing but broken walls and scattered bricks. Or you might see something else, the ghostly outline of what was or what might have been, the shimmer of an idea that has proven more durable than stone, the persistent dream of a garden that reaches toward heaven. The wind moves through the palm fronds, a sound that would be familiar to anyone who lived here 3,000 years ago. The Euphrates flows, continuing its patient work of giving and taking away, creating and destroying, making life possible in an impossible place. The desert stretches to every horizon, reminding all who enter it that nature makes harsh demands, that survival here requires exceptional effort and ingenuity. Against this backdrop, the hanging gardens, whether real or legendary, make their statement. They say that humans need not merely survive, but can thrive, can create beauty, can transform their environment rather than simply adapting to it. They say that love might inspire impossible achievements, that kings might build mountains for queens, that engineering could serve not just practical needs, but aesthetic dreams. They say that paradise is not lost, but can be recovered or recreated through sufficient vision and effort. As sleep approaches, as consciousness begins to drift, the gardens become more rather than less real. In the space,